then Eilidh's going to come and share.
The reading this morning is taken from Luke chapter 24, starting at verse 13. And in the church Bibles, you can find it on page 1061. So Luke 24, starting at verse 13. Now that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the 3rd day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further, but they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together, and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the 2 told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Eilidh, and I serve on the clergy team alongside Dave and Andy. It's really nice to see so many of you here this morning. If you're visiting, we do have quite a few visitors with us today. We're carrying on in a series looking at spiritual disciplines. And we've looked at things like prayer, we've looked at things like generosity, keeping Sabbath, and today we're landing on the subject of guidance. I don't know if you guys are good at making decisions. Maybe you're very decisive people. Maybe you know your mind and you're able to commit to decisions very easily. I'm not one of those people. And somewhere where this becomes really apparent is whenever I'm in a restaurant. When I'm in a restaurant, what I will do is I will firstly irritate people quite a lot because I'll try and offload my decision making. And I'll do this by luring in the waiting staff. So what I'll do is I'll ask them questions like, "If you were me, would you have the chicken or the fish? If you were me, do you think you'd get an extra side? If you were me, do you think this is going to fill me up because I'm quite hungry today?" And I get various responses. sometimes waiting staff, they play the game with me. Yeah, so sometimes they'll be like, oh, well, I mean, obviously it's all good, but yesterday I had the such and such for my lunch and it was delicious. And I'm like, oh, great, good, you're playing the game. This is excellent. I can make my decisions based on what you're saying. But recently, it didn't go very well. One waitress, she was quite a young waitress, and I did that whole, if you were me, and she just replied to me, she curled her lip, and that was a really important detail because she just looked at me like that. And she said, yeah, but I'm not you, am I? And the curled lip suggested that she had no desire to be me or anyone like me. I said, oh, okay, thanks anyway. I'll just go with the chicken then. So it doesn't always work for me. But what I'm trying to do there is minimize the risk of my decision. I don't get out to eat out at restaurants all that often, so it's quite exciting when I do. So the stakes are high. I want to pick a really good dish. I don't want to be sitting across from somebody wishing that I had their plate instead of the plate that was in front of me. I want to minimize the risk, and I'm doing my research. Research is really important. So when I go in, I'll be reading the menu. I might even have looked at the menu on the website before I go, but I'll be doing my research there around the menu. I'll also, as I'm sitting there thinking about the menu, I'll be looking at what the waiting staff are bringing out to other tables, extensive research, and then I'll be asking the expert, the waiting staff, what they would have. So we do our research, we look at what others are doing, we ask the experts. It's kind of what we do, well, it's what I do in restaurants, but it's what we do in life, isn't it, when we're making decisions? We try and do our research and make the best, well-rounded decisions. But there comes a point, doesn't there? There comes a point where we just have to place the order, we have to just commit, and then jump into the abyss of the decision that we've taken and hope that the waitress is going to bring something good in front of us. Making decisions can be really tough, and it's why this topic of guidance this morning is so huge. And if we are Christians, the question of what does God want me to do with my life is one of the biggest that we can ask ourselves. And so how do we find the answer to that? Well, I'm not going to cover centuries of Christian thought on this because there's a lot of words that have been spilled over this. But what we can do is look at this passage and see how these disciples walking along to Emmaus on this road see some really practical things that we can learn from their encounter with Jesus. It's Cleopas was one disciple, and we don't know who the other one was. They're not named. Some think it was a friend. Others think it was his wife. So we're not sure. We have Cleopas and this other. And what struck me, and maybe what reassured me about this encounter, was just how ordinary it was. Knowing what God wants for their lives, hearing from God, there's a lot of ordinary things in this story. So we're going to take two headings this morning. First of all, ordinary Jesus. And then secondly, ordinary disciples. They're not terribly creative headings, but hopefully you'll remember them. So first of all, ordinary Jesus. Can I ever say that about somebody who's just risen from the dead? But we'll see what I mean. So Jesus' presence is so ordinary that these two people, they don't even recognize who he is. He just draws up to them as they're walking along the road. Very ordinary. And at times, I think we treat this whole subject of guidance like we're contestants on a game show. Who wants to be a millionaire? Anybody? You know what I'm talking about, yeah? That game show, okay? So we might treat it like that. We trot along quite nicely with those questions at the lower level. We earn our £100, we earn our £200. We know the answers. This is easy. We don't need to pull in any lifelines. We don't need to ask anyone what we're doing. I'm just ticking along quite nicely. But then, as the stakes get higher, and maybe I get a little bit less certain on the answer, then I'm going to start relying on my lifelines. I might ask for a 50-50. I might want to phone a friend, because the risks feel higher, and I want to be sure. And isn't that the same in life in general? We can tick along day to day quite happily. We don't need to ask anybody's help. We can make these small decisions. We can order off menus, no problem. But then a bigger decision comes. We hit a crunch time, and it's then we want to ask God for his input. It's then we'll go to him and look for guidance. What should I study? Where should I live? Should I go on a second date? Should I get a puppy? That one's for me. Yes, we should, Andy Proudfoot. We look for the thunderbolt or the audible voice to tell us what the right answer is. And then we wonder why we can't hear anything. Why is God not answering me? Well, here's a question for us. Do we even know what we're listening for? Do we know what we're listening for? Because here, on the road to Emmaus, without fuss, without fanfare, comes the newly risen Jesus. He just draws up alongside them and joins in their conversation, walks along with them. He is so subtle and so gentle that they don't recognize him. And it's in verse 28 and 29, we see that they had to urge him to stay. Jesus, he wasn't going to outstay his welcome. He wasn't going to impose himself on them. He does the initiating, and then it's up to us. We can be so busy looking for the big and the dramatic that we don't see Jesus in our everyday. Maybe it's that small idea that you have bubbling away in the back of your mind. Or maybe it's just that nudge to phone somebody that you haven't spoken to in a while. Or it might be that glad feeling that we get when we've participated in something. Or it might be just that prick of our conscience. The list of those examples could go on, but have we ever considered that those tiny little things, they might be God at our side in our everyday? The difficulty many of us have with guidance is our seeming lack of solid evidence or proof. But we're living by faith and not by sight. That's the point. We're living by faith. So every decision, be they big or they small, they're a little bit of a jump. They're a little bit of a leap. We have to have faith. And we have a tendency to go to God when we reach a big junction or a big decision. But even when there are no obvious decisions on our horizons, we could be keeping company with Jesus, just walking and talking with him along the road, bringing the small things to him. Because these small things, they set us in a direction. If you were here a few weeks ago, you would have heard all about the crazy tale of me completing my Duke of Edinburgh hike. For those of you who don't know what Duke of Edinburgh is, it's an award scheme for young people, and it culminates in an expedition. You have to go to quite a remote place, and the Gold Award, which is the highest one you can do, you have to camp overnight in a wild place for 3 nights, and you're walking for 4 days. Quite arduous. And I went here to the Isle of Skye, which was a terrible decision. Skye is beautiful, but it was hailstoning when I went. So the point of the story, when we were doing our training walks, we had to sit with an instructor, and it used to drive me crazy. I didn't like it because the instructor he'd take us out on these practice walks, and every 10 minutes, without fail, whether it was raining or not, we had to stop, we had to lift our maps that were hanging around our necks, and we had to get our compass out, and we had to take a little bearing every 10 minutes. And we had to point where we were on the map, and we had to give him our grid reference, and we had to point, there's the loch on the map, there's that hill on the map. We knew exactly where we were. So when the instructor wasn't there on the real walk, me and the other girls, we were like, well, let's not bother with that nonsense. We just want to get there as quickly as possible, don't we? Which is why, a few weeks ago, if you were here, you'll remember the tale of how we got lost and we walked in the wrong direction for 2.5 hours before we had to backtrack. And the reason that happened is we were not checking with the small points. We weren't checking as we were going along the road. We weren't checking with our compasses. We weren't taking bearings all the way along. So then when we did reach a junction that we had to get our maps out and try and use these compasses, we weren't confident. We weren't totally sure that we were reading the compass correctly. We hadn't been checking the small things. So when it came to the bigger turns, we didn't do so well with them because we weren't very good at reading the compass. Jesus said in John, "My sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me." Maybe one small starting point for us before we bring the big and the dramatic crunch points of our life to God maybe we should try just some everyday plodding along with God. Maybe we should just be inviting him into our everyday walks. Because I wonder for some of us, if, like me with a map and a compass, we're just not confident. We don't know his voice. It's not familiar to us because we haven't been listening. The sheep know the shepherd's voice and they trust it and they follow it because they've spent all day, every day in the company of the shepherd. They know him. So rather than wait to ask God, where do you want me to live? I can maybe be asking, how would you have me live in this day? Instead of asking, what should I do with my life? Maybe we could be asking, what would you have me do with the life you have given me today? These daily questions, that daily looking to Jesus for the really small and ordinary things, it lays the foundation for guidance for the bigger things. They set us in a direction. So Jesus enters this scene in a really ordinary way. And then he does some really ordinary things with them. The man who's just conquered death, he leads a Bible study and he breaks bread with them. That's how he chooses to reveal himself to them. Bible study and eating together. Really ordinary things that 2,000 years later, we as a church are still doing. And sometimes we think they must be a bit dull. There must be more radical things that we could do. But the risen Jesus thought that they were a good idea. Notice how he approaches the Bible as well. He takes them through the Bible, explaining what was said in all the scriptures about what? About what they should do? About God's rules for their lives? No. He takes them through all scripture to see what it says about him, about Jesus. It says in verse 27, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. And sometimes we come to scripture trying to read it like a manual for life. Like we try and pluck verses, often out of context, and we treat them like advice for the way ahead. But when we see him approach scripture, it's all about him. So if we're trying to read the Bible, trying to find me in it, we're not going to find that. But if we're coming to the Bible trying to find Jesus in it, well, that's when we're going to know who he is and how he wants us to live. In studying the Bible and breaking bread together. Ordinary Jesus. Ordinary us. What about these disciples? What can we learn from them? Well, the first thing to say is that they were just walking along the road together. They were talking about all that they had seen and heard in these days. And so there's a question for us. Do we do that? Do we share our experiences? Do we share our experiences of life and faith with one another? Do we have conversations that go beyond the weather and maybe what we've been doing at work? Because these are the conversations that Jesus will enter into, where we will help one another to walk in step with God. Do you have a person or do you have people in your life that you can talk with these things about? It might be a friend, it might be a mentor or a spiritual director, it might be your Connect group or another group at church. We can really encourage one another and help one another by talking what we're seeing in our lives, where we're seeing God at work. And notice that they're talking as they are on the move. Seeking guidance, it's not like a passive activity. We don't just kind of wait for the dream job to land in our lap. We have to explore, we have to apply, we have to push doors. We don't just lie down and think, well, God's going to do whatever he's going to do, so I'll just wait here and wait for it to happen. It was while they were walking along the road, putting one foot in front of the other, that Jesus came along. We're moving along the road together. I know some of you here have studied philosophy, and if you have, there's a chap, Søren Kierkegaard, who is a 19th century philosopher He's from Copenhagen. I think we'll see a photo of him shortly. I studied a little bit of this guy when I was at university, and I have to say, I don't remember lots about him or really his work, but I do remember my lecturer saying that he was renowned for his hair. Look at that hair. Apparently, one book said that the quiff at the front of his hair, it was the talk of the town. It went 6 inches high, apparently. So that's why I always, whenever I read a Kierkegaard quote, I always think, the guy with the hair. So there you go. There's the guy with the hair, the magnificent mane. And he said this: life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forward. It can be hard when we are people who live in motion to look back. Maybe you are a naturally quite reflective person. Maybe you consciously take time to reflect on the year that's been or the term that's been. And lots of us will have to do this routinely as part of our jobs anyway. We might need to reflect on our practice. And I'm not excellent at looking back. I don't love doing it. But I do wonder if Kierkegaard was onto something with this. Because understanding can come when we look back. And it's as these disciples look back at their very ordinary encounter with Jesus, it's then they realized how significant it was, how their hearts had burned within them. They didn't seem to notice that at the time. As most of you know, I was ordained last year, but before I was accepted to study theology, I had to go through a couple of years of something called the discernment process, and that involves quite a lot, and it involves talking to a lot of different people and going in front of a few panels, and together you're meant to discern if you are actually called to ministry. And during that process, I was asked to look back. They said, you need to look back and see where God has been at work in your life over the years. And it was so interesting. It was so hard. I didn't really want to do that, but I had to. And it was a very interesting exercise. But it revealed that often Jesus had been walking and talking along the road with me, and I hadn't really been aware of it. One example of this is a conversation that I had one night. I think it was probably in 1994. And it was in a green Renault Clio. The car should be coming up here. There it is. That is the exact car that this happened in, if you remember those cars. And it was a conversation that I had with my Girls' Brigade leader. Now, if you don't know what Girls' Brigade is, it's kind of like Girl Guides, but they have faith. So it's like Christian Girl Guides, which I'm probably not selling it very well. But I really enjoyed Girls' Brigade. So I was having a conversation with my leader who was driving me home in her car. This was the car. And we were just talking and going along the road, maybe something of a modern-day equivalent of what Cleopas was doing. And we had a kind of an unremarkable conversation. I remember a bit about it. I remember getting out of the car that night. I went inside, put the TV on, and I remember thinking, she was probably pretty wrong. I probably didn't agree with her. But then I remember also thinking, but she's ancient, so what does she know? Now, this woman, she was maybe 40. At the time, she was not ancient. But I tried to just brush off the conversation and not think about it. But it sparked thoughts and questions that would occasionally pop into my mind over the years. I never gave it too much thought, but they just carried on. But it wouldn't be until 25 years later that I would realize the significance of that conversation. Because I look back on that conversation now, and I can see that my heart burned within me. I can see that Jesus had been there. He'd been in that conversation. And I only realized that when I was encouraged to look back. As we move forwards, do we ever take time to look back? Because it might help us to see where God has been. And there are lots of ways you can do that. Maybe you would like to explore things that will help you to look back if you're not good at it like me. So there are different ways that we can use journaling to help us look back, or praying, like the prayer of examine. And these are kind of routines that we can give ourselves that force us to look back, maybe at the end of a term, or at the end of a day, at the end of a year. But just trying to notice where we might have missed Jesus' ordinary presence. Because these were pretty ordinary people doing some pretty ordinary things. The discipline of guidance then, like so many of these spiritual disciplines, it's a daily thing. It's not just for the big crunch points in our lives. It's daily walking and talking with Jesus. It's getting to know the shepherd's voice, inviting him to get involved in our everyday. Waiting staff in restaurants, they don't really care if I order a side dish. I don't think Jesus really has an opinion on that either. But on this road to Emmaus, we meet gentle Jesus, who comes alongside, who's walking with us and talking with us. He meets us in the breaking of the bread. He meets us in his word. But it's in the everyday that we get to know the shepherd, to know his voice, and to trust it so that we can follow him. Andy.